The in-laws laughed as they gave the black woman the abandoned house as her inheritance, not knowing that the house was made of gold. "That old rotten house is more than you deserve," Margaret Thornton declared, throwing the rusty keys on the polished mahogany table. "Consider yourself lucky we're not leaving you empty-handed." The Thornton mansion echoed with muffled laughter as the family gathered for the reading of Robert Thornton Jr.'s will. Keisha Williams sat quietly in the leather chair that seemed to swallow her, watching her in-laws and brothers-in-law discreetly celebrate her humiliation. At 28, Keisha never imagined she would lose her husband in a car accident and, 3 days later, discover that her grief would be turned into a spectacle for her in-laws' entertainment. The will was clear: she would inherit only a rundown property on the outskirts of town, while the Thorntons got the businesses, investments, and the family mansion. "That house doesn't even have working electricity," laughed Thomas Thornton, Robert's older brother, adjusting the gold watch on his wrist. "Dad bought that ruin 20 years ago and never managed to sell it. At least now it's good for something." The family lawyer, Dr. Harrison, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, technically, the property was specifically designated for Mrs. Williams in the original will signed by her late husband." Robert was clearly confused in his final months, Margaret interrupted, shooting Keisha a cold look. "Probably influenced by certain people who take advantage of rich, vulnerable men." Keisha finally stood up, slowly picking up the keys. Her eyes met Margaret's for a moment that seemed to last forever. "Thank you for your generosity," she said with a calmness that made some of the guests feel inexplicably uncomfortable. "We hope you'll be happy in your new residence," Thomas added with venomous sarcasm. "It's just the kind of place that suits people like you." As she walked toward the door, Keisha allowed herself an almost imperceptible half-smile. What the Thorntons didn't know was that Robert had told her about the true value of that property 3 months before he died. Nor did they know that she had spent the last few weeks discreetly researching the history of the house they thought was just a worthless ruin. There, in front of all those looks of superiority and contempt, Keisha maintained the composure of someone who was keeping a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. If you're enjoying this story of twists and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a supposed humiliation would turn into the greatest lesson a prejudiced family would ever receive. 3 days after the will was read, Keisha received a text message from Margaret Thornton. "You have 1 week to remove your things from the property. After that, we will consider it abandoned and take appropriate legal action. P.S. I hope you enjoy your new mansion." The house was 45 minutes out of town, at the end of a dirt road that wound through ancient trees. When Keisha finally arrived in her borrowed car, she understood why the Thorntons had laughed so much. The 2-story structure looked like it had been abandoned for decades: cracked windows, peeling paint, weeds growing up to the porch. But something made Keisha smile for the first time in weeks. She recognized the house immediately. "Mom, this house looks haunted," her 16-year-old daughter Jasmine muttered as she reluctantly got out of the car. "Are you sure Dad Robert wanted you to have this?" Keisha walked slowly to the front door, her hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. "Your stepfather brought me here once, 3 years ago. He said it was the most special place he knew, but that the family would never understand its true value." At the time, Robert had been mysterious about the property. He had talked about buried secrets and hidden treasures in plain sight. Keisha had thought he was being romantic, speaking metaphorically about childhood memories. Now, looking at the house that everyone else considered worthless, she was beginning to understand that perhaps Robert had been more literal than she had imagined. As they explored the dusty rooms, Keisha's phone rang. It was Thomas Thornton, his voice slurred from what was clearly not his first drink of the day. "I hope you're enjoying your inheritance, Keisha," he laughed cruelly. "Dad always said that house was a curse. He spent a fortune trying to tear it down in the 90s, but the structure is too solid. At least now it's your problem." "Too solid?" Keisha repeated, feigning confusion. "What does that mean?" "It means you're going to spend more money trying to fix that ruin than she'll ever be worth. Or give up and live in a slum, which is where you should have been all along." After Thomas hung up, Keisha stood in what had once been the living room, processing his words. Too solid to tear down. Robert had mentioned something similar years ago, about how the house had withstood storms, fires, and even attempts to tear it down. "It's like she's indestructible," he had said, looking at the walls with an admiration that had seemed exaggerated at the time. Jasmine was upstairs, testing the floor's resistance with cautious steps. "Mom, come see this." These walls are weird. When I knock on them, the sound is different. It's like they're denser. Keisha ran upstairs, her heart racing. In the master bedroom, Jasmine was running her hands along the wall, frowning. It doesn't make sense. The wall feels thin on the outside, but when you knock on it, the sound suggests there's something much thicker inside. That night, back at the small apartment they rented, Keisha stayed up researching the property's history online. What she discovered made her wonder if Robert had been much more strategic in his choices than anyone could have imagined. The house had been built in 1852 by a miner named Cornelius Golden, a name that now seemed less coincidence and more prophecy. Golden had discovered a rich vein in the nearby mountains, but historical records showed that he had died before revealing the exact location of his mine. What intrigued Keisha most was a footnote in an obscure academic article. Golden was known to incorporate his own gold into the construction of his residence, creating a structure that has survived all demolition efforts over the centuries. At 2 in the morning, Keisha finally understood why Robert had insisted so much that she get to know every corner of that house during her only visit. He wasn't being sentimental. He was preparing her for this moment. Each new humiliation from the Thorntons only strengthened something inside her that they couldn't see, a quiet determination fueled by the very arrogance they tried to impose on her. What those prejudiced people didn't know was that every act of contempt was writing their own sentence of defeat, word by word, insult by insult. The next morning, Keisha returned to the house with borrowed tools and a determination that surprised even Jasmine. "Mom, are you sure about this? Shouldn't we hire someone?" "Not yet," Keisha replied, carefully examining a section of the wall where the paint had peeled away naturally. "First I need to make sure what we're dealing with here." As she delicately scraped away at a small area with a putty knife, her phone rang. It was Margaret Thornton, her voice laden with feigned concern. "Keisha dear, I've heard from some neighbors that you're trying to renovate that horrible house. You do realize you're going to spend far more money than it's worth, don't you?" "I'm just doing some basic cleaning," Keisha lied deliberately, watching tiny golden fragments sparkle in the morning light streaming through the broken window. "Well, I have a generous offer for you. My brother Thomas is willing to buy the property for $5,000. That's way more than she's worth, but we consider it family charity." The word charity was delivered with such venom that Keisha almost laughed. "5,000, Keisha repeated, pretending to consider it seriously as she watched what were clearly veins of gold running through the interior wall structure. "That's an interesting offer." "Exactly. You could use that money to rent a decent apartment in the city, in a neighborhood more suitable for people like you. Think of Jasmine. She deserves to grow up in a proper environment." After Margaret hung up, Keisha stared at the golden fragments in her hand. $5,000 for a house that was probably worth millions. The Thorntons' arrogance knew no bounds. That afternoon, she did something she hadn't done since Robert's death. She called Dr. Samuel Chun, an old family friend who worked as a geologist at the local university. Robert had always said that Sam was the most honest person he knew, someone who could be trusted completely. "Keisha, I'm so sorry about Robert. He was an extraordinary man," Sam said when she explained the situation. "You said you suspect there's gold in the structure of the house? I know it sounds crazy, but actually, it doesn't. There are historical records of 19th-century miners incorporating precious metals directly into their buildings as a form of protection against theft. It was more common than people realize." Sam agreed to visit the property discreetly over the weekend, bringing portable detection equipment. "But Keisha, if your suspicion is correct, you need to be extremely careful. Properties with that kind of value attract all kinds of unwanted attention." Meanwhile, the Thorntons stepped up their psychological campaign. Thomas showed up at the house on Thursday unannounced, finding Keisha cleaning the downstairs rooms. "Jesus Christ, do you really believe you can do anything with this ruin?" He laughed cruelly, kicking a piece of rotten wood. "Look at this. The structure is completely compromised. You'll spend $50,000 just to make it livable." "Maybe," Keisha replied calmly, continuing her work. She had learned to read the signs. The more agitated Thomas became, the more nervous he was about something. "Listen, I'll be straight with you. My family has plans for this area. Commercial development. If you sell now, everyone wins. If you insist on staying, you'll find that having business neighbors can be complicated." The veiled threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. Thomas continued, "Besides, Are you sure you can afford the property taxes? Because I hear they went up significantly this year. After he left, Keisha realized that the Thorntons weren't just trying to humiliate her, they were trying to force her to give up quickly, before she found out something she shouldn't. This only confirmed her suspicions. On Saturday, Dr. Chun arrived early, driving an unmarked car and carrying a bag of equipment. I hope I'm wrong and you're right, he said with a smile as he set up the portable metal detector. The first readings were inconclusive, but when they reached the master bedroom on the second floor, the equipment began to emit consistent, strong signals. Keisha, Sam whispered, staring at the display, these numbers are extraordinary. They systematically tested every wall in the house. The results were unequivocal. The entire structure contained significant amounts of gold, not just as ornamentation, but as an integral part of the construction. Cornelius Golden had literally built a house of gold, disguised under decades of paint and surface deterioration. How much do you think it could be worth? Keisha asked, her voice barely controlling her excitement. Sam did some quick calculations on his notebook. Conservatively, between $8 and $12 million. Possibly more, depending on the purity and complete distribution. That night, while Jasmine slept in the small apartment, Keisha lay awake planning her next steps. She would need a lawyer specializing in mineral rights, an independent appraiser, and strategies to protect the property legally before the Thorntons discovered what they had lost. But first, she would do something Robert had always admired in her: strategic patience. She would let the Thorntons continue making ridiculous offers and veiled threats while she documented every attempt at coercion and every prejudiced word. On Monday, Margaret called again. Keisha, Thomas says you still haven't accepted our generous offer. Frankly, we're losing patience. $7,500, last offer. I'll think about it, Keisha replied, looking out the window at the house the Thorntons considered a useless burden. Behind the surface deterioration, a fortune waited patiently for someone smart enough to recognize its true value. That was when she smiled for the first time since the funeral, not just out of relief, but out of anticipation. Because something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would completely rewrite the rules of the game the Thorntons thought they were winning, turning every gesture of arrogance into evidence of their own blindness, word for word, threat for threat. The following Wednesday, Keisha did something that surprised even Dr. Chun. She scheduled an official meeting with the entire Thornton family at the office of the lawyer who had drawn up the original will. I agree to sell the property, she announced calmly over the phone to Margaret, who immediately called an emergency family meeting. But I want everyone to be there to sign the papers. Thomas, Margaret, and any other interested heirs. Margaret could barely contain her malicious glee. You've finally come to your senses. I knew you'd realize that house is a dead weight. We'll be there at 2. What the Thorntons didn't know was that Keisha had spent the last 2 weeks meticulously documenting every attempt at coercion, every veiled threat, every prejudiced comment. Dr. Chun had brought in a certified independent appraiser, and she had hired Dr. Patricia Williams, a lawyer specializing in mineral rights and racial discrimination. At 2 o'clock sharp, the Thorntons arrived at the office like hungry predators surrounding wounded prey. Thomas carried a bottle of champagne discreetly hidden in his briefcase. Margaret had even brought flowers, to celebrate your sensible decision, as she explained with false generosity. So let's get down to business, Thomas said, rubbing his hands together eagerly. $10,000, final. It's more generosity than you deserve, considering the taxes you'll save. Dr. Harrison, the original lawyer, seemed uncomfortable with the predatory atmosphere. Well, technically, Ms. Williams is entitled to an independent appraisal before any. Not necessary, Margaret interrupted. We all know that property isn't worth the taxes she'd have to pay on it. We're doing charity here. It was then that Keisha smiled for the first time in the meeting. You're right about one thing. The property has been appraised. She slid a folder across the mahogany table, by 3 different independent appraisers. Thomas laughed as he casually opened the folder. Let me guess, someone said it's worth $15,000-20,000? Still our offer. His voice simply died as his eyes focused on the first document. The number highlighted in bold on the official geological appraisal report made his face drain of all color, $11,400,000. That has to be wrong, he stammered, passing the document to Margaret with visibly shaking hands. It can't be right. Actually, it's conservative, said Dr. Chun, entering the office at that exact moment. After further testing, we estimate between 12 and 15 million, depending on the complete extraction. Margaret stared at the document as if she were looking at a poisonous snake. Gold? How did you know about this? Because my husband told me 3 months before he died, Keisha replied calmly. He discovered it by accident during genealogical research on Cornelius Golden. Robert wanted to protect me, so he left the property specifically to me, knowing you would consider it worthless. Thomas stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. That's impossible. Dad would have told us. He would never hide something like this from the family. How did you hide the family business's debts? Keisha asked softly, sliding another folder across the table. Or the attempts to sell family property without the consent of the other heirs. Robert hired a private investigator 6 months before he died. He knew exactly who you were. The revelations piled up like a devastating avalanche. Documents proving that Thomas had embezzled company funds. Recordings of conversations where Margaret planned to force Keisha to give up any inheritance. Emails detailing how they intended to use racial discrimination to intimidate her into giving up. You recorded our conversations? Margaret whispered, her voice finally losing all its arrogance. I recorded every one, Keisha confirmed, playing a crystal-clear phone conversation on her laptop. Thomas's voice echoed through the office. Let her try to fight it in court. A poor black woman against our family? She'll give up in 2 weeks when she realizes she can't afford lawyers. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Margaret sobbing. The realization of what they had lost, and how their own words had betrayed them, was too devastating to process. Dr. Patricia Williams finally spoke. In addition to the property, my client is suing the family for racial discrimination, coercion, and attempted will fraud. The recordings and documents provide substantial evidence for significant moral damages. Thomas tried one last desperate gambit. Listen, we can work something out. You get the house, and we split the mining profits. 50-50. Keisha looked at him with the same expression she would have had watching a child throw a tantrum. Thomas, you just found out you tried to steal $15 million from a pregnant widow. And now you want to negotiate. She stood up calmly, gathering her documents. The property is rightfully mine. The lawsuits against you will proceed as normal. And you have 72 hours to vacate any property still in Robert's name, because the private investigator also discovered that you're delinquent on inheritance taxes. Margaret lifted her mascara-streaked face. Keisha, please, we're family. Family. Keisha repeated softly. I remember you telling me that a rundown house was more than I deserved. That my daughter should grow up in a neighborhood appropriate for people like us. Now you realize you've wasted the opportunity of your lives out of pure prejudice. She walked toward the door, then turned back one last time. The irony is delicious, don't you think? You tried to give me trash as my inheritance, but what you thought was trash is worth more than everything you own combined. As the revelations piled up and the masks fell one by one, a question hung in the tension-filled air. Was it possible that an entire family fortune could crumble because of the very arrogance they believed to be their greatest strength? What would happen when the rest of high society found out that the prestigious Thorntons had lost millions because of pure prejudice, proving that sometimes justice comes in such a poetic way that even the most creative screenwriter couldn't come up with something more satisfying? 6 months after the devastating meeting at the lawyer's office, Keisha's life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. Cornelius Golden's house was now home to the Golden Heritage Foundation, an organization dedicated to protecting historic properties in marginalized communities and providing free legal advice to families who were victims of real estate discrimination. Jasmine, now 17, attended one of the best private schools in the area, not because Keisha wanted to flaunt her wealth, but because she could finally offer her daughter all the opportunities Robert had always dreamed of for them. The girl had developed an interest in mining rights and planned to pursue a career in law, inspired by her mother's struggle. Mom, there's another letter, Jasmine announced one morning, handing her an elegant envelope bearing the crest of one of the city's oldest families. That's the 5th family asking us to reconsider old differences this month. Keisha laughed as she prepared coffee in the modern kitchen that had been built on the first floor of the historic house. The Golden structure remained untouched out of respect for Cornelius Golden's legacy, but she had created functional spaces that honored both the past and the present. Meanwhile, the Thorntons faced a very different reality. Thomas had lost not only the court case, which resulted in a $2 million judgment for racial discrimination and attempted fraud, but also his license to operate any business in the real estate industry. Recordings of his prejudiced conversations had gone viral on social media, completely destroying his professional reputation. Margaret, meanwhile, had discovered that her high society friends had selective memories when it came to public scandals. The country club had temporarily suspended her membership, and the social events she used to attend mysteriously stopped including her on their guest lists. "Did you hear that they're living in a rented apartment?" Dr. Chun commented during one of his visits to the foundation. Thomas tried to get a job as a broker in 3 different cities, but his history always follows him. Keisha nodded without malice, focused on reviewing the documents of a new family in need of legal assistance. Sometimes the consequences of our choices take time to arrive, but they always do. The most impressive transformation had taken place in the local community. Keisha's story had inspired dozens of other families to question suspicious property documents and abusive real estate contracts. The Golden Heritage Foundation had already recovered more than 50 properties that had been obtained through fraudulent or discriminatory contracts. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had become not only a lawyer for the foundation but a close friend, often joked about the poetic irony of the situation. The Thorntons spent decades accumulating property through questionable practices, and now you're dismantling their empire one deed at a time. One October afternoon, Keisha received an unexpected phone call. It was Margaret Thornton, her voice a far cry from the arrogant woman she had met at the will reading. "Keisha, I know I have no right to call you, but I need to talk," the trembling voice came through the line. He's in serious trouble. He's been drinking too much, lost his apartment. I wanted to know if there's any way we can make things right." Keisha remained silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the garden where Jasmine was studying under a 100-year-old tree. "Margaret, you had a choice. You could have treated me with dignity, respected Robert's wishes, included my daughter as part of the family. Instead, you chose prejudice. I know we made mistakes. But don't you think we've suffered enough?" "This isn't about suffering," Keisha replied calmly. "It's about consequences. You didn't lose everything because I wanted revenge. You lost everything because you spent your entire lives making choices based on arrogance and discrimination. I just documented those choices." She paused, feeling the weight of the responsibility that her fortune had brought her. "But I will do one thing. The foundation has a rehabilitation program for people who have lost everything due to legal problems. If Thomas wants to voluntarily participate in sessions on racial discrimination and historical reparation, we can help him find housing and decent work." Margaret cried on the other end of the line. You would do that? After everything?" "I would do it because it's the right thing to do. Not because you deserve it, but because every human being deserves a second chance to become a better person." 6 months after that conversation, Thomas Thornton was attending weekly reflection groups on racial privilege at the Golden Heritage Foundation. He was a visibly broken man, but for the first time in his life, he seemed to be genuinely trying to understand the impact of his actions on other people. Margaret never showed up for the programs, but she sent a formal letter of apology that was published in the local newspaper. It was a small but significant start. During the foundation's 1-year anniversary ceremony, held at the Golden House itself, Keisha was invited to speak to an audience of more than 200 people, including politicians, activists, and families who had been helped by the organization. 2 years ago, I sat in a room where people told me that an abandoned house was all I deserved, she began, her voice echoing through the main hall. They laughed when they gave me the keys, thinking they were humiliating me. The audience was completely silent. Today, that house is a symbol that no injustice remains hidden forever. That no prejudice is stronger than the truth. And that sometimes, what our oppressors consider trash is exactly what we need to build something greater than they could ever imagine. The applause was deafening, but Keisha smiled as she thought of Robert. He had found a way to protect her even after death, leaving her not only a fortune, but a lesson on how to turn injustice into justice, humiliation into dignity, and hatred into opportunity for others. Jasmine, now about to graduate and planning to study law at Harvard, often asked her mother if she felt anger toward the Thorntons. "Anger is a feeling that consumes you from the inside," Keisha always replied. "I chose to use that energy to build something they could never destroy. The best revenge isn't destroying your enemies, it's becoming so successful that they become irrelevant." The Golden Heritage Foundation continued to grow, not only as a social justice organization, but as living proof that sometimes the universe has a perfect poetic sense of humor. The Thorntons tried to give trash as an inheritance, but ended up handing over the keys to a revolution that would completely rewrite the rules of the game they thought they were winning. And every time Keisha walked through the halls of the house that was once considered a worthless ruin, she smiled, remembering that sometimes justice doesn't come like a hammer, but like a golden revelation hidden beneath layers of prejudice, waiting patiently for the right person to discover that even what seems worthless can contain unimaginable treasures. If this story of reversal and justice touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to believe that no injustice lasts forever. Leave a comment. What would you do if you found out that your greatest humiliation was actually the greatest gift of your life?